Welcome to the Blue Suit Files. Picture this scenario for a second. You have an angry GS-12 civilian director practically screaming at you across a desk.
Right. Not a great start to the day.
Yeah, exactly. And across the base, your flight line repair team is 72 hours behind schedule. They are completely exhausted.
Which is a massive risk factor.
It is. And to top it all off, your most reliable, hardest working staff sergeant just failed their mandatory physical fitness test. So what do you do?
That is the ultimate question, isn't it?
Right, because if your instinct is to pick the solution that sounds the most, harmonious or the most agreeable, the nicest option, you have just failed the United States Air Force's most brutal psychological filter.
You've walked right into the trap.
I mean, literally. The mission for today's deep dive is an intensely analytical, entirely clinical examination of the WAPS SJT resource development document.
Yes, we are breaking down the situational judgment test.
Exactly. This is the psychometric filter utilized to identify which non-commissioned officers are actually ready for intermediate leadership as technical sergeants, and which ones are just really good technicians who are pretending to be leaders.
It's a harsh distinction, but a necessary one.
Very harsh. I want to set the stakes for you right out of the gate.
Yeah.
Moving from the rank of staff sergeant to technical sergeant is not about rote memorization.
No, not at all.
It's not about proving you can turn a wrench faster or write an EPR better than anyone else in the room. It is a fundamental psychological shift.
The complete rewiring of how you operate.
Right. This transition demands advanced emotional intelligence, cognitive flexibility, and really a complete recalibration of how you perceive organizational risk. I have to note for you, the listener, today's deep dive is going to be highly information dense. It's going to be clinical.
We are focusing purely on the psychological architecture of leadership.
Yeah, and the catastrophic clinical consequences of failing to adapt to this tier.
Well, the clinical reality of this transition is that it ruthlessly exposes the limitations of tactical proficiency.
I mean, it strips away your technical armor.
Exactly. A staff sergeant operates primarily within a very defined technical scope. Yeah. They execute tasks, right? And they train junior personnel on those specific tasks.
Which is important, but it's localized.
It's very localized. The situational judgment test, or SJT, is explicitly designed to filter out candidates who cannot transcend that tactical, task-oriented mindset.
It's looking for a broader perspective.
Right. It assesses a candidate's capacity to function as frontline supervisor, a resource manager, and a strategic intermediate leader.
So it's a massive leap in scope.
Huge.
Yeah.
To pass this psychometric filter, you have to demonstrate the ability to navigate really complex organizational dynamics. You have to integrate diverse capabilities and manage friction points across completely different operational echelons.
And if you don't?
Failure to comprehend the academic frameworks underpinning these expectations. It doesn't just mean you fail a test. In the real world, it results in systemic leadership failure.
And that is exactly why we need to unpack the theory before we look at the actual test questions. Because the SJT does not operate in a vacuum, does it?
No, it's anchored to very specific cognitive and behavioral science theories.
Right. So if you don't understand the rules of the game, you are going to trigger every single trap they have set for you. Let's start by clinically dissecting the core psychological systems underpinning these expectations.
Where do you want to start?
Let's begin with Robert Sternberg's concept of tacit knowledge and Gary Klein's recognition prime decision model. Can you break down how these two frameworks actually operate in a military environment?
Certainly. So, Sternberg's triarchic theory of intelligence identifies tacit knowledge as the critical factor in practical intelligence.
Okay, practical intelligence.
Right. Tacit knowledge is procedural. It is knowing how to execute a function within a highly ambiguous environment.
As opposed to just knowing facts.
Exactly. Which is fundamentally distinct from analytical intelligence, which is just knowing that a fact is true.
So it's the application.
Yes. As an intermediate leader, you're expected to acquire specialized executive processes. Psychologists call these metacomponents.
Metacomponents, right.
These allow you to recognize complex organizational patterns that, frankly, a novice would entirely miss.
Okay, so how does this tie into Klein's model?
Well, this tacit knowledge is the fuel for Gary Klein's recognition prime decision, or RPD, model.
RPD, got it.
In time-critical military scenarios, you rarely have the luxury of analytically comparing multiple courses of action on a whiteboard.
Right, nobody is pulling out a flow chart in a firefight.
Exactly. The RPD model dictates that experienced leaders utilize experience-based intuition and mental simulation. You evaluate a situation rapidly, generate a plausible course of action based on internalized doctrine, and you execute decisively without succumbing to endless data gathering.
So the test is actually measuring that intuition.
Yes. The test evaluates this by presenting scenarios where the optimal response relies on instantly recognizing underlying friction points, like an impending safety violation or a severe resource constraint, and then applying an intuitive, structurally sound response pattern.
I think the distinction between knowing that and knowing how is the crucial takeaway there. I mean, to put it in plain English, tacit knowledge is the difference between reading a physics manual on fluid dynamics and actually knowing how to survive a riptide.
That's a perfect analogy.
Right. You can possess perfect analytical intelligence regarding the technical specifications of your equipment. You can quote the manual verbatim.
Which a lot of great staff surgeons can do.
Exactly. But if you lack the tacit knowledge to navigate the bureaucratic and human friction required to actually deploy that equipment under duress, well, your analytical intelligence is operationally useless.
Operationally useless, yes.
And that human friction brings us directly to Hersey and Blanchard's situational leadership model. How does this theory dictate the way a technical sergeant should actually manage their people?
Situational leadership theory is essentially the diagnostic engine for technical sergeant evaluations. The framework posits that there is no single optimal supervisory style.
So there's no one-size-fits-all.
Precisely. Effective leadership demands that you seamlessly shift your behavior based entirely on the developmental readiness of your subordinates. You must constantly transition between directing, coaching, supporting, or delegating.
And readiness isn't just about rank, right?
Right. Readiness is categorized by varying degrees of competence and commitment. The critical failure point evaluated by the test is the inability to accurately diagnose this readiness.
Because if you get the diagnosis wrong,
If you misdiagnose your people, you apply the wrong leadership style. And this leads to the most pervasive failure mode among candidates. Psychometricians refer to it as the SSGT trap.
okay, let's spend a minute on the SSGT trap, because from what I'm reading in these sources, this is the #1 reason people fail the SJT.
It absolutely is.
So, the SSG trap occurs when an intermediate leader applies a highly directive, task-focused style to experienced subordinates who actually require support or delegation.
They're treating seasoned veterans like brand new airmen.
Exactly. In other words, you are micromanaging personnel who already possess technical competence. What are the actual clinical consequences when a leader falls into this trap?
The clinical consequences are catastrophic to the structural integrity of a unit. When you over-supervise experienced senior airmen and staff sergeants, you actively suppress their professional growth.
You're stifling them.
Completely. You are broadcasting a signal that you lack trust in their capabilities, which naturally immediately degrades unit cohesion and destroys psychological safety.
And it hurts the leader too, right?
Oh, absolutely. By focusing your cognitive bandwidth on individual task execution, by getting down in the weeds to do the work yourself, you abdicate your actual responsibilities as a technical sergeant.
Because you're too busy doing a staff sergeant's job?
Right. Your job at that tier is NCO development and delegation strategy. By doing the work of a subordinate, you degrade the organization's capacity to operate autonomously.
What about the other end of the spectrum?
Well, conversely, the model also dictates that underguiding inexperienced personnel is an equal failure. So, delegating complex tasks to novices without appropriate follow-up.
So both extremes are fatal.
Yes, both extremes indicate an inability to accurately assess organizational capability.
Okay, so you have to be perfectly calibrated to the person in front of you, but you are trying to achieve that calibration in an environment that is, frankly, chaotic.
Usually highly chaotic.
Which transitions us to the constraints placed upon these decisions. Herbert Simon's theory of bounded rationality. This essentially defines the operational environment of the Air Force, doesn't it?
It maps onto it perfectly.
You are operating under conditions of profound uncertainty, high operational tempo, and finite computational resources. I mean, you simply do not have the time to make the perfect choice.
Perfection is a myth in that environment.
Right. And this brings us to a fascinating concept called satisficing. Explain why demanding perfect optimization in a military environment is actually considered a clinical error.
Bounded rationality is an academic acknowledgement that human beings do not possess infinite time or cognitive resources to make perfectly optimized decisions.
We just don't have the processing power.
Exactly. Simon introduced the concept of satisficing. It's a linguistic hybrid of the words satisfying and sufficing.
Satisfying and sufficing, I like that.
Right, so a decision maker acting as a satisficer seeks a solution that is satisfactory and sufficient to achieve the immediate operational objective, rather than paralyzing the organization in pursuit of a flawless outcome.
Because the flawless outcome takes too long.
In tightly coupled military processes, demanding perfect optimization leads directly to analysis paralysis. When time is the critical variable, a delayed optimal decision is frequently much worse than an immediate sufficient decision.
So how does the test measure this?
The SJT embeds severe time pressures and competing stakeholder demands into its scenarios. It evaluates your capacity for this exact mechanism. You must demonstrate the ability to make sound, timely risk decisions.
Balancing the scales.
Right, balancing the benefits against the potential costs without unnecessarily deferring authority to a higher echelon just because you are afraid of making a mistake.
That makes total sense. Satisficing is essentially triage in an emergency room. You don't have time to meticulously stitch up a superficial cut when the patient in the next bed is dealing with arterial bleeding.
You focus on the immediate threat to survival.
Exactly. You apply a tourniquet, you stabilize, and you move on. You are trading absolute perfection for operational survival. In a military context, accepting managed risk is mandatory. It is not optional.
If you attempt to eliminate all risk, you eliminate all operational output.
Wow, yes. And this requirement to operate within ambiguity forces us to confront Lawrence Kohlberg's theory of moral reasoning. Because ethical dilemmas at this tier rarely present themselves as binary black and white choices, do they?
Rarely, if ever. They exist in incredibly murky gray zones.
So contrast Kohlberg's pre-conventional and conventional moral reasoning with the post-conventional expectations of an intermediate leader.
While Kohlberg's framework outlines the psychological progression of moral development in human beings, junior personnel frequently operate at the pre-conventional or conventional levels.
Meaning what, exactly?
These levels are characterized by strict rote rule following. It's a rigid conformity to explicit social order. At the conventional level, morality is defined simply as obeying the written rule, without question.
Which is how most people are trained initially.
Yes. However, technical sergeants are evaluated on their capacity for post-conventional moral reasoning. This requires evaluating situations through the lens of universal ethical principles, justice, and the spirit of Air Force core values.
Rather than just blindly following the letter of the law.
Exactly. As an intermediate leader, you will routinely face conflicts between chain-of-command directives, subordinate welfare, and mission integrity, where the regulatory guidance is highly ambiguous. Sometimes it's even contradictory.
And the test looks for how you handle that ambiguity.
Yes. Strict rule following that completely ignores the human element or the broader operational context is a clear indicator of lower moral reasoning.
I want to push on that for a second, because this is critical. Are you saying the test actually penalizes you for following the rules too strictly? Because, in the military, we are conditioned from day one in basic training to follow the instructions exactly as written.
It penalizes you for following rules blindly when doing so creates a larger systemic failure.
Okay, so context is everything.
The clinical risk here is severe. If you apply mechanistic draconian punishments without analyzing the contextual environment, you risk causing localized moral injury to your subordinates.
Localized moral injury, that's a heavy term.
It is. And the subject matter expert consensus utilized in scoring these tests heavily penalizes rigid punitive reactions. They favor nuanced, human-centric leadership.
You still have to hold people accountable, though, right?
Absolutely. The expectation is that you maintain accountability while fostering rehabilitation. You cannot just act as a bureaucratic punisher. You must navigate the intent behind the regulation.
That is a massive paradigm shift. Now that we have the academic frameworks established, we need to transition to how the situational judgment test actually weaponizes these psychological concepts to trap unprepared candidates.
The traps are very well hidden.
They really are. The test is a carefully constructed psychometric architecture. It's designed to expose your cognitive blind spots. Let's detail the mechanics of this architecture. First, how does the consensus-based scoring model actually work?
So the test architecture does not rely on arbitrary right or wrong answers defined by a single author sitting in a vacuum. It utilizes a consensus-based scoring model derived from panels of current, highly successful subject matter experts.
So it's based on reality?
Yes. This ensures that the highly effective options reflect collective operational wisdom and strict doctrinal alignment. The trap, therefore, is not a trick question engineered by a test writer.
What is it then?
The trap is your own psychological bias. The test actively exploits response distortion and something known as social desirability bias.
Okay, social desirability bias. This is the nice guy trap, right?
Exactly.
This occurs when a candidate instinctively selects options that sound appealing, harmonious, or, socially acceptable, but they entirely fail to address the root systemic cause of an organizational issue.
Right. You want to be liked.
You essentially choose the option that makes you look like a benevolent, caring person, all while quietly allowing the organizational failure to persist and rot from the inside.
That's precisely it. Candidates fall victim to this because they naturally prioritize effective harmony, which is the avoidance of emotional conflict over cognitive conflict.
And cognitive conflict is what we actually want.
Right. Cognitive conflict is the factual, sometimes uncomfortable resolution of a systemic problem. Linked directly to this is the concept of implicit trait policies.
What does that mean in practice?
This psychological phenomenon suggests that respondents inherently judge behaviors that express their own current personality traits as more effective.
So if I'm immature, I pick the immature answer.
Basically, yes. If you lack intermediate leadership maturity, your implicit trait policy will dictate that a tactical, staff sergeant level response is the most effective choice. You intuitively select options that align with your current flawed maturity level.
Because your baseline hasn't shifted yet.
Exactly. Because your psychological baseline has not shifted to the technical sergeant tier. The test specifically presents distractors that cater to these immature trait policies.
Give me an example of what that looks like on the test.
Well, for example, it will offer choices that bypass regulations just to maintain artificial harmony, or options that pass all responsibility up the chain of command so you can personally avoid accountability.
And to an immature leader, those look like smart moves.
They look like smart protective maneuvers. But to a psychometrician, they are glaring red flags.
We must also address the systemic problem of construct-irrelevant variance, which sounds like incredibly dense jargon.
It is, but it's vital to understand.
In plain English, construct-irrelevant variance occurs when factors outside the targeted psychological construct negatively impact a candidate's score. For instance, failing a math test, not because you don't know math, but because the word problems were written in a language you don't fluently speak.
That's a great way to put it.
Explain how a failure to catch rank dynamics or span of control leads to complete scenario misinterpretation on the SJT.
Construct-irrelevant variance in this specific context frequently manifests as a failure of analytical reading comprehension.
So people just read the question wrong.
Essentially, yes. A candidate may perfectly understand the leadership theory, but they failed to catch the specific rank dynamics embedded in the scenario stem.
Like who they are actually talking to.
Right. If you are reading rapidly and fail to notice whether the actor you are interacting with is a senior airman, a fellow staff sergeant, a senior non-commissioned officer, or crucially, a Department of the Air Force civilian, you will invariably choose a highly ineffective response.
Because the rules of engagement change completely based on who it is.
Absolutely. Civilian labor relations require vastly different authority boundaries than military subordinate discipline. Furthermore, candidates frequently overlook AFSC agnostic constraints.
Meaning constraints that apply across the whole Air Force, regardless of your specific job.
Exactly. Limitations like fiscal law or equal opportunity mandates. To avoid this variance, you must clinically isolate the actors, identify the specific resource constraints, and note the exact time pressures before you even attempt to apply a leadership framework to the answers.
That is the perfect setup. We are now shifting this deep dive from the realm of theory directly into clinical practice. We are going to initiate a rigorous, relentless dissection of the 15 calibrated scenarios mapped to this test document.
This is where the theory hits the pavement.
I want to look at every single one, because each one is a carefully laid trap. We begin with Theme 1, NCO Development and Delegation. This anchors to Air Force Handbook 1, Chapter 14, Developing Others. Let's look at Scenario 1.
Okay, lay it out.
It involves a heavy maintenance section. You are the NCOIC. Your flight chief has tasked your section with a fleet-wide equipment inspection ahead of a major readiness exercise. You have 3 staff sergeants and 10 junior airmen under you.
A decent span of control.
Yes, but the deadline is 72 hours away. You walk out to the floor and observe 2 of your staff sergeants taking on the bulk of the complex inspection tasks themselves. They state the timeline is slightly too tight to risk novice mistakes from the airmen, and it is faster if they just do the heavy lifting themselves.
A classic rationalization.
The staff sergeants are visibly exhausted, sweating through their uniforms, and the junior airmen are just standing around watching, waiting for instruction. Now, if I'm an inexperienced test taker, my instinct is to look at option C.
And what does option C say?
It suggests you jump in, grab some tools, and take over a portion of the inspections yourself to relieve the burden. I mean, that sounds like incredible teamwork. You are leading from the front. You aren't just sitting in an office. You are in the trenches with your people. Why is that the wrong answer?
That instinct right there is exactly what the test designers are hunting for. It is the ultimate manifestation of the SSG trap.
Because I'm doing the work instead of leading.
Right. By doing the work yourself, you completely abandon your NCOIC responsibilities. You are confusing tactical output with strategic capacity.
I see.
If you jump in, you reduce your strategic span of control from an entire section down to that of a single technician. You are failing to develop your subordinate NCOs, and you are leaving 10 junior airmen completely untrained.
Okay, so let's analyze option B. This suggests you order the staff sergeants to stop what they're doing, assign all tasks directly to the junior airmen, and tell the staff sergeants to only intervene if a critical safety violation occurs. That sounds like delegation, though. Isn't delegation what we want?
It is abdication masquerading as delegation.
Abdication? Wow.
A consequence here is severe safety risk. You are applying a purely delegating style to airmen who are at a highly inexperienced readiness level, missing the mandatory coaching element entirely.
You're just throwing them to the wolves.
Exactly. Abdicating complex, heavy maintenance work to untrained personnel under immense time pressure is a dereliction of safety protocols.
Then we have option E, which suggests you publicly reprimand the staff sergeants in front of the junior airmen for poor time management, and then assign the airmen to inspect critical components just to prove a point.
That is incredibly destructive. The clinical consequence of this action is catastrophic damage to psychological safety.
Because you're dressing them down in public.
Right. Public correction destroys the NCO's authority in the eyes of their subordinates. And assigning complex tasks out of spite introduces lethal risk to the maintenance process.
So what is the actual solution?
The highly effective correct answer is option A. This requires you to pull the staff sergeants aside, acknowledge the severe time pressure they are under, and direct them to step back from executing the physical tasks.
So you force them to stop turning wrenches.
Yes. You help them draft a rapid on-the-job training sequence where they supervise the airmen performing the work, ensuring safety while developing team capacity.
Option A is the precise application of situational leadership theory. You are forcing the staff sergeants to shift from a doing mindset to a coaching mindset.
It's forced professional development.
The pattern recognition cue here is incredibly clear. When you see the phrase NCOs doing the work while airmen stand around, you must immediately initiate a delegation and NCO development strategy. You must violently resist the instinct to solve the tactical problem yourself.
Let the technicians be technicians and you be the leader.
Let's move to scenario 7. This shifts into the nightmare of matrix management complexities.
Those are always tricky.
You are a TSG element leader in an aircraft maintenance unit where personnel are frequently pulled to support cross-functional launch teams. A production superintendent, who is a master sergeant, tasks your subordinate staff sergeant to leave their current post and lead a complex repair on the flight line.
Okay. Competing demands.
Yes, because you've already assigned this specific staff sergeant to conduct critical, mandatory upgrade training for 3 new airmen today. The staff sergeant feels torn between the immediate operational demand of the master sergeant and the developmental mandate you establish.
A very common scenario.
My immediate thought looking at this is, well, it's a master sergeant. They outrank me. Option C says you tell the staff sergeant that the master sergeant outranks you both, so they must abandon the training task without question and go to the flight line. Doesn't military structure demand that we obey higher rank?
Military structure demands respect for rank, but intermediate leadership demands resource protection. Option C is the highly ineffective choice. The clinical consequence of yielding completely to positional rank without advocating for your section's established priorities is the absolute destruction of the unit's training pipeline.
Because you're just rolling over.
Exactly. It represents an absolute abdication of intermediate leadership responsibility. You are demonstrating zero backbone.
Let's evaluate option D. This suggests instructing the staff sergeant to take the 3 new airmen out to the flight line and conduct their upgrade training while simultaneously leading the complex repair the master sergeant demanded. That sounds like killing 2 birds with 1 stone.
It is cognitive overload resulting in massive safety degradation.
Right.
Combining a complex, high-pressure operational repair with initial upgrade training for novices guarantees that neither task will be executed effectively.
Yeah.
You are exposing the new airman to severe physical risk in an uncontrolled environment.
What about option A? It suggests forcing the airman to stay late to accomplish both sequentially. Do the repair first, then do the training after hours.
That damages morale and sets a dangerous precedent. It assumes the external task automatically overrides your structural prioritization without any attempt at clarification or pushback. A technical sergeant must negotiate resource boundaries, not simply surrender them.
So you have to push back. How?
The highly effective correct answer is option B. You must intervene directly with the production superintendent, explaining the conflict and negotiating an alternative solution,
Like what?
like assigning a different qualified NCO to the repair. This protects the original staff sergeant's time for their mandatory upgrade training. You are acting as an organizational buffer, executing cross-functional negotiation to protect long-term developmental pipelines against short-term tactical demands.
You are literally stepping in front of the bullet for your people. That is fascinating. Let's look at scenario 14, which introduces civilian boundaries into this NCO development theme.
This is where construct-irrelevant variance gets people.
Right. You are the NCOIC of Pass and Registration. Your office is managed by a GS-12 civilian director. The GS-12 habitually bypasses you entirely, walking right past your desk to directly assign menial administrative tasks to your staff sergeants.
Pulling them away from their primary duties.
Exactly. Your NCOs are incredibly frustrated by the conflicting priorities. Now, when a civilian is bypassing my authority and messing with my NCOs, my blood pressure spikes. Option B suggests filing a formal grievance against the GS-12 with the Civilian Personnel Office for overstepping military chain of command. Why shouldn't I drop the hammer on them legally?
Because it is a catastrophic bureaucratic overreaction.
Really?
Yes. The clinical consequence of option B is the immediate weaponization of the work environment. You are utilizing formal litigation and HR complaints for what is essentially a workflow communication issue.
So it's the nuclear option.
Exactly. Doing so destroys any future collaborative potential with the civilian director.
Okay. Option C suggests a different extreme. Intercepting all communication and demanding the GS-12 funnel every single request, no matter how small, through you, strictly enforcing a barrier. That stops the interruptions, though. It protects the NCOs.
It does, but the consequence is the creation of a mechanistic bottleneck. You are artificially degrading the efficiency of the entire office out of territorial insecurity. You become a single point of failure.
And option E. It suggests threatening the GS-12 by stating they have no legal authority to speak to military personnel.
That is factually incorrect and demonstrates a complete lack of emotional intelligence. It will immediately fracture the total force leadership dynamics.
So what's the middle ground?
The highly effective correct answer, option D, requires you to schedule a professional peer-to-peer meeting with the GS-12 to clarify organizational roles. You establish a unified workflow system where tasks are prioritized collaboratively without bypassing your NCOIC authority.
So you build a system together.
Right. When a civilian bypasses the chain of command, the psychological imperative is boundary enforcement via collaborative workflow design, not aggressive stonewalling or formal complaints.
That perfectly transitions us to Theme 2, Resource Stewardship. Scenario 2 introduces a fiscal dilemma that I think every NCO has faced at some point.
End of year funds.
Yep. You are the NCOIC of a logistics readiness section. It is the end of the fiscal year. Your flight commander rushes in and informs you that $15,000 in fallout funds must be obligated within 48 hours, or the squadron loses the money.
A classic pressure cooker.
Your government purchase card holder, who is a staff sergeant, presents a highly researched list of non-essential break room upgrades and high-end ergonomic chairs equaling exactly $15,000. However, you know your deployment processing line operates with malfunctioning barcode scanners that severely impact your operational tempo.
The real need versus the shiny want.
Exactly. The scanners cost $12,000, leaving $3,000 unspent. The staff sergeant vehemently argues that leaving money on the table will result in a smaller budget for the squadron next year, and they urge you to just buy the chairs.
The pressure to execute the budget at the end of the year is massive.
It is. Option C says you yield to the staff sergeant's recommendation to buy the furniture to ensure 100% of the funds are spent. Why is that a failure?
Because it is a violation of ethical resource stewardship.
But you're spending the money like command wants.
Yes, But the clinical consequence of yielding to the staff sergeant just to execute the budget demonstrates a purely transactional mindset. You are allowing false urgency and an arbitrary financial metric hitting the $15,000 mark to override actual critical operational capability.
It shows a severe lack of intermediate leadership backbone.
Precisely. Let's look at option A, which suggests buying the scanners for $12,000, but then allowing the remaining $3,000 to be wasted on the break room just to hit the 100% execution mark.
Compromise, right.
A flawed one. This suffers from the exact same ethical decay. You are still wasting taxpayer funds on non-essentials purely for the optics of budget execution.
Option D suggests rejecting the furniture and independently sourcing the gear yourself, completely bypassing the staff sergeant GPC holder. That gets the right gear, though.
It achieves the tactical objective, but the consequence is the destruction of trust. You fail to develop your subordinate's understanding of resource management by just taking the card away and doing it yourself. You fail the structural leadership requirement.
Finally, option E suggests escalating the decision to the flight commander to make the final call.
This is an abdication of NCOAC authority. A technical sergeant is expected to manage resource conflicts at their echelon without paralyzing higher headquarters.
So what do we do with the leftover $3,000?
The highly effective answer is option B. You direct the staff sergeant to procure the scanners to address the critical shortfall, and then you rapidly consult with other NCOACs in the squadron, your lateral peers, to see if the remaining $3,000 can fulfill their mission-critical needs.
Wow, that's brilliant.
This is the epitome of post-conventional moral reasoning applied to taxpayer funds.
Yeah.
You identify the operational priority and demonstrate an enterprise perspective.
Scenario 9 compounds this complexity by merging resource stewardship with a civilian program manager. You are newly assigned as the NCOIC of base contracting. The flight is led by a GS-11 civilian program manager.
Okay, different dynamic here.
Right. You discover that a military-specific training budget intended to send your staff sergeants to an advanced contracting course has been quietly reallocated by the GS-11 to purchase commercial software for the civilian staff.
Oh, that's going to cause friction.
Massive friction. The GS-11 states the software benefits the overall flight efficiency more than the training class. Your staff sergeants are incredibly upset, as this training is vital for their military career progression. Now, if I find out my people's training money was stolen for software, I want to go to war.
Actually.
Option B suggests confronting the GS-11 publicly during a staff meeting, aggressively demanding the money be returned to the military side. What is the fallout there?
The clinical consequence of a public attack on a civilian director is the immediate generation of a toxic climate. You are transforming a structural funding issue into a hostile interpersonal conflict, demonstrating zero emotional intelligence. You will lose that battle.
What about option E? It suggests authorizing the staff sergeants to purchase their training using a completely different flight budget without informing the GS-11, sneaking around the system.
Exactly. The clinical consequence of secretly using unauthorized funds is misappropriation of government resources. It is an explicit ethical breach and gross insubordination. It could end your career.
Option C suggests immediately escalating to the military squadron commander to pull rank on the GS-11 and force the issue.
This utilizes positional power prematurely. It proves to your command that you are incapable of lateral negotiation.
And option A, instructing your NCOs to just use free online tutorials to keep the peace with the civilian.
That is conflict avoidance masquerading as compromise. You are completely failing to advocate for the mandatory developmental requirements of your subordinates.
So what's the highly effective path?
The highly effective correct answer is option D. You request a private meeting with the GS-11, present the specific military regulatory requirements for the skill level upgrades, and collaboratively explore alternative funding sources to accomplish both procurements.
You bring data, not emotion.
You advocate for your people using data, not emotion. You replace effective conflict with cognitive conflict.
We're transitioning now into part 2 of our clinical breakdown, shifting into the highly volatile arenas of cross-functional coordination and risk management. Theme 3 addresses cross-functional friction.
This is where things get really messy.
Scenario 3 involves airspace scheduling. You are a TSD-SJT section chief in an operations support squadron. A peer TSDT in the intelligence flight comes to you and complains that your staff sergeant schedulers are repeatedly changing airspace times without adequate notice, which is severely disrupting the intel briefers.
Okay, peer-to-peer conflict.
Yes. You investigate and find out your staff sergeants are complying with the exact letter of the local operating instruction, the LOI, which requires a 2-hour notice for changes. However, intel realistically requires 4 hours to build an accurate threat brief. Tensions are rising rapidly. Airmen are openly blaming each other in the halls.
The system is broken.
But if my people are following the written regulation, option A seems bulletproof. Instruct your staff sergeants to strictly adhere to the 2-hour LOI requirement and tell intel they just need to adapt and work faster. Why would I punish my people for following the rules?
Because the rule is broken. The clinical consequence of rigid adherence to a flawed regulation is bureaucratic paralysis.
Even if it's in writing.
Yes. This is a classic failure of analytical thinking, demonstrating conventional moral reasoning where rule following supersedes actual mission effectiveness. If intel doesn't have time to build the brief, the mission fails, regardless of what the LOI says.
Let's look at option D. This suggests taking the issue directly to the squadron superintendent to referee.
Escalating a lateral peer-to-peer conflict to a senior NCO is an outright abdication of intermediate leadership. You are clogging the organizational command structure with friction that is explicitly your responsibility to resolve.
Option B suggests unilaterally rewriting your LOI to a 4-hour notice. That solves the tactical problem, doesn't it?
It solves the tactical problem, but it fails systemically because you exclude your staff sergeants from the problem-solving process. You destroy their buy-in and miss a massive developmental opportunity to teach them how to fix broken systems.
Okay, so the answer has to involve them.
Yes. The highly effective correct answer is option C. You arrange a collaborative sit-down meeting between your staff sergeants and the Intel NCOs to find a compromise that supports both scheduling flexibility and Intel preparation.
So you get everyone in the room.
You are bridging a workflow gap by transitioning the environment from effective conflict, where airmen are blaming each other, back to cognitive conflict, focusing purely on fixing the LOI discrepancy.
Scenario 8 introduces joint medical readiness and severe time constraints. You are in a joint environment acting as the unit deployment manager. A short notice tasking drops, requiring 2 personnel to deploy in exactly 14 days.
That's a tight window.
Very tight. You identify 2 eligible senior airmen, but their medical readiness indicators in the system are red, meaning they are non-deployable due to overdue immunizations. The Joint Medical Clinic is notoriously backlogged and scheduling routine appointments 4 weeks out. The flight commander expects a green readiness posture report on his desk by tomorrow morning.
The pressure from the commander here is immense.
It is. Option D is the most terrifying distractor to me. It suggests reporting the senior airman as deployable on the commander's report today, assuming you can just get the appointment sorted out in the next 14 days before they leave. How common is that urge, and what is the real-world consequence?
It is incredibly common under pressure, and it is the most dangerous distractor on the board. The clinical consequence of falsifying a commander's readiness report is catastrophic.
It's an integrity violation.
It is a severe integrity violation that carries immediate UCMJ implications. Operationally, you are risking deploying medically unfit personnel into a combat zone. It is a fatal failure of risk management.
Option B suggests physically walking the airman into the clinic, bypassing the front desk, and aggressively demanding they be seen immediately due to the deployment.
The consequence of bullying sister flight personnel is the generation of massive affective conflict. You might achieve the tactical goal once, but you permanently destroy the inter-squadron professional relationship. They will never help you again.
Option A suggests immediately reporting them as non-deployable and returning the tasking to the commander.
This demonstrates a complete lack of perseverance. You are surrendering to bureaucratic friction without even attempting a systemic solution.
So how do you fix a medical backlog?
The highly effective answer, option C, requires you to utilize your cross-functional network. You contact the NCOIC of the medical clinic directly, peer-to-peer, explain the short notice operational requirement, and successfully coordinate priority appointments.
That's tacit knowledge in action.
Exactly. This is the purest application of tacit knowledge. You are bypassing the bureaucratic backlog through professional lateral networking to achieve mission output.
That brings us to Scenario 13, which presents a time-critical, cross-functional dispute that could ground an aircraft. You are the NCOIC of a cargo processing element. The aerial port suddenly rejects 3 of your deployment pallets, claiming the hazardous materials paperwork is incorrect.
Cargo disputes are brutal.
Your staff sergeant insists the paperwork is perfect and accuses the aerial port inspectors of making up rules. The aircraft departs in 4 hours. The staff sergeant is irate and wants to escalate the issue to the group commander immediately.
Panic setting in.
Right. With 4 hours to take off, option D suggests bypassing the aerial port inspectors entirely, driving the pallets straight to the aircraft yourself, and instructing the loadmaster to accept them. If I know the paperwork is right, why not just bypass the gatekeepers?
The clinical consequence of that action is extreme. Bypassing HAZMAT inspectors introduces catastrophic flight safety risks and explicitly violates federal transportation law.
So you could go to jail.
Yes, or bring down an aircraft. It represents a total collapse of procedural rationality in the face of time pressure.
Let's look at option E, which suggests calling the aerial port, angrily demanding acceptance over the phone, and threatening them with the inspector general if they delay the flight.
The consequence of screaming and utilizing threats is the crystallization of effective conflict. Human nature dictates they will intentionally dig their heels in. They will ensure your cargo is delayed through malicious compliance, checking every single strap and bolt.
Option A, escalating to your squadron commander like the staff sergeant wants.
That wastes executive leadership bandwidth on a routine regulatory dispute that a technical sergeant is doctrinally required to manage.
So the solution is face-to-face.
The highly effective correct answer is option C. You drive over to the aerial port with your staff sergeant, request a face-to-face meeting with their TSGD shift supervisor, and collaboratively review the paperwork against joint regulations to resolve the discrepancy.
De-escalation through presence.
You de-escalate the emotional intensity by moving the interaction to a factual, regulatory review. You cut through the hearsay by conducting a face-to-face evaluation.
We now move to theme 4, risk management and bounded rationality. This is where the life and death decisions happen. Scenario 5 deals with severe weather and base access.
This one is intense.
Very. You are a TSGD flight chief for security forces. During morning rush hour, a massive, severe weather system drops visibility at the main installation gate to near zero. Traffic is backing up onto the civilian highway, creating a massive and escalating risk of high-speed collisions.
Real-world physical danger.
Local procedure dictates 100% ID checks visually matched to the driver's face. The staff sergeant working the gate requests permission to temporarily implement a bypass procedure to alleviate the highway backup, accepting a slight reduction in ID strictness to get cars off the lethal highway.
The ultimate test of rigid rules versus real-world risk.
Exactly. Option B mandates maintaining the 100% visual match standard regardless of the highway backup. The rule's the rule, right? Security first.
The clinical consequence of rigid adherence to standard operating procedures while actively ignoring an escalating real-world threat to life, the impending highway collisions, demonstrates zero analytical thinking.
It's just blind compliance.
It is the epitome of the rigid rule-following trap. You are protecting the base from a theoretical threat while ensuring civilian casualties on the highway.
Conversely, option A dictates ordering the staff sergeant to abandon ID checks entirely and just wave traffic through to clear the highway.
The clinical consequence of this extreme overreaction is a direct violation of federal installation security law. You expose the installation to an unquantifiable threat, demonstrating an absolute failure of risk calibration.
Option C is the SJT trap rearing its head again. Leaving the base defense operations center to run out into the weather and conduct the ID checks yourself?
You abandon your command and control over the entire installation for a minimal tactical speed increase at one single gate.
Option D suggests holding all traffic while requesting an exception to policy from the installation commander.
This induces analysis paralysis. A real-world, rapidly degrading emergency cannot wait for a general officer to wake up and approve a routine contingency response.
So you have to satisfice.
Yes. The highly effective answer is option E. You conduct a rapid, real-world risk assessment, authorize the staff sergeant to implement approved contingency procedures for inclement weather to balance security with the collision risk, and simply notify the chain of command of your decision.
You are balancing the scales yourself.
You are satisficing the requirement, balancing the immediate threat to life against the baseline security posture using established protocols.
Scenario 11 is the ultimate test of bounded rationality under extreme duress. You are the NCOIC of an emergency room during a Wing Inspector General mass casualty exercise. The IG is grading your every move.
High stakes, high visibility.
Suddenly, a real-world trauma patient arrives. Your primary diagnostic machine is offline for a mandatory 30-minute calibration. An older backup machine is available, but your junior technicians are less familiar with it, and it produces results much slower. Option E suggests waiting the 30 minutes for the primary machine to finish calibration to ensure a perfect, rapid diagnosis for the trauma patient. 30 minutes isn't that long to guarantee perfection, is it?
In severe trauma, 30 minutes is a lifetime.
Right.
The clinical consequence of demanding perfect optimization when human life is actively degrading is a fatal error. This is analysis paralysis resulting in patient death.
Option D suggests sending the trauma patient to a downtown civilian hospital to prioritize the integrity of the graded IG exercise.
Diverting a critical casualty to protect a numerical grade on an inspection is a profound misalignment of Air Force core values and a complete, grotesque failure of moral reasoning.
What about option B? It suggests aborting the calibration midway to turn the primary machine back on.
This risks rendering the machine completely useless or yielding lethally inaccurate results due to disrupted software.
So what's the RPD application here?
The highly effective correct answer, option A, leverages the RPD model. You halt the exercise, direct your most experienced technician to use the older backup machine to satisfy the diagnostic requirement and notify the physician while the primary is expedited.
So you accept the slower machine.
The technical sergeant recognizes that real-world life safety instantly overrides exercise parameters. By placing the most experienced technician on the older machine, you mitigate the risk of slower results. The machine isn't perfect, but it is sufficient to save a life.
We advance to the final batch of scenarios, Part 3, Ethics and Performance. These address the most sensitive areas of intermediate leadership. Theme 5 focuses on performance management. Scenario 6 details an overworked staff sergeant failing a PT test.
This happens far too often.
It does. You are the NCOIC. An exceptional technician and highly respected supervisor completely bombs their official physical fitness assessment. During the debrief, they admit they have been working 12-hour shifts for 2 months to cover a severe manning shortfall, and they simply stopped prioritizing personal fitness to keep the mission afloat.
They sacrifice themselves for the unit.
Yes. I know what the natural human instinct is here. Option B dictates minimizing the failure, hiding it from the commander, and delaying the administrative paperwork until they can pass a mock test in a few weeks. They sacrificed for the mission. Shouldn't I protect them from the bureaucracy?
That is the social desirability bias whispering to you. The clinical consequence of falsifying or purposefully delaying mandatory official documentation is the normalization of deviance.
It sets a terrible precedent.
It creates severe legal liability for the command, and if discovered, it entirely destroys your credibility as a leader who enforces standards. You cannot selectively enforce Air Force regulations.
But look at the opposite extreme. Option D dictates strictly issuing the paperwork, reprimanding them, and telling the staff sergeant that time management is their personal problem to fix on their own time.
The consequence of strict paperwork without structural support is toxic mechanistic management. It completely ignores the unit-driven operational tempo that caused the failure in the first place, and it will permanently alienate a previously exceptional NCO.
Option C suggests removing the staff sergeant from their supervisory role over a single PT failure.
That is a draconian overreaction that unnecessarily deprives the unit of a capable leader and devastates section morale.
So you have to issue the paperwork but also help them.
Exactly. The highly effective answer is option A. You issue the mandatory administrative documentation for the failure, because standards are standards, but then you collaboratively develop a structured recovery plan, adjusting their grueling shift schedule to ensure they have dedicated, protected time for physical conditioning during the duty day.
You fix the environment that caused the failure.
You balance administrative precision with rehabilitative emotional intelligence. You recognize the structural root cause, the 12-hour shifts, and you adjust the environment to facilitate their recovery.
Scenario 12 exposes the dark side of physical fitness. A punitive PT leader. You oversee a staff sergeant who runs the flight's mandatory PT program. Airmen begin to complain that the staff sergeant allows personnel scoring above 90% to skip mandatory sessions, while subjecting those scoring in the 80s to grueling, punitive, hazing-style workouts.
Two very different sets of rules.
Right. The staff sergeant argues this incentivizes excellence and prevents coddling. The flight's overall PT pass rate is incredibly high, but morale is deteriorating rapidly. If the pass rate is high, doesn't that justify the methods? Option C suggests ignoring the complaints because the ultimate metric, the pass rate, proves the methods are effective.
A high pass rate is a statistical mirage if it is covering deep cultural decay. The clinical consequence of ignoring toxic, hazing-adjacent behavior for short-term statistical gains is the absolute destruction of long-term unit health and psychological safety.
You are institutionalizing disparate treatment.
Exactly. Option A suggests making the workouts easier for the average performers, but allowing the 90% scorers to continue skipping. This fundamentally fails because it maintains a two-class system. Mandatory PT is a regulatory requirement for all personnel. Skipping it cannot be utilized as a behavioral reward.
Option D suggests taking the program away from the staff sergeant entirely and running it yourself.
This fails to develop the staff sergeant's leadership skills, representing conflict avoidance rather than corrective mentorship. High-performance metrics can never be utilized as a shield to justify punitive, inequitable leadership environments.
So we have to correct the behavior.
The highly effective answer is option B. You must formally counsel the staff sergeant on the distinct difference between incentivizing excellence and punitive leadership. You direct them to execute a redesign of the program to challenge all fitness levels equitably. You address the toxic leadership trait directly while initiating a developmental redesign.
Theme 6 concludes our scenario dissection with ethical leadership and civilian relations. Scenario 4 involves insubordination from a GS-9 civilian.
Civilian discipline is a minefield.
It is. You are the NCOIC of a medical administration clinic. A military staff sergeant comes to you highly frustrated because a GS-9 civilian employee flatly refused to complete a new data entry task, claiming it is not in their job description. The staff sergeant wants you to write a formal letter of counseling, an LOC, for insubordination to maintain military discipline in the office.
The military mind immediately goes to paperwork.
My military brain says insubordination requires immediate paperwork. Option B dictates supporting your staff sergeant by drafting the military LOC for the civilian. What happens if I hand a civilian an LOC?
The clinical consequence of attempting to issue punitive military disciplinary paperwork to a civilian employee without human resources coordination is catastrophic.
How bad?
You immediately expose the military command to formal labor grievances, union intervention, and potential federal litigation. It is an act of profound administrative ignorance.
Because they aren't under the UCMJ.
Exactly. Civilian personnel operate under strict labor laws and specific core personnel documents, not the Uniform Code of Military Justice.
Option E suggests forbidding the staff sergeant from interacting with the GS-9 entirely and taking over all daily supervision yourself.
This destroys team cohesion and manifests a complete lack of strategic delegation, placing an unsustainable supervisory burden entirely on your own shoulders.
Option A suggests just taking the task away from the civilian and assigning it to the military staff sergeant to keep the peace.
That is mere conflict avoidance. It resolves the immediate deadline, but entirely fails to establish a sustainable, policy-driven solution for the new requirement.
So we have to consult their specific contract.
The highly effective answer, option D, demonstrates an advanced understanding of total force management boundaries. You review the civilian's core personnel document, the CPD, and consult with the Civilian Personnel Office to determine if the task actually falls within their legal scope.
And what about the staff sergeant who wants blood?
Simultaneously, you sit down and explain the legal differences between military and civilian supervision to your staff sergeant so they understand why you can't just hand out an LOC.
Scenario 10 evaluates sharp violations, sexual harassment assault response, and prevention in an ambiguous environment. You are a TSGT instructor at a training detachment. You overhear fellow TSGT instructors in the break room making sexually suggestive comments about a new female lieutenant.
This is a highly sensitive situation.
The lieutenant is not present, but several junior airman students are in the room and are visibly uncomfortable. This is where social desirability bias screams at you to stay quiet. Option A suggests ignoring the conversation entirely because the target, the lieutenant, is not present, and intervening would alienate your peers and make the break room incredibly awkward. What is the fallout of giving in to that bias?
The clinical consequence of ignoring this event is that you as an NCO become explicitly complicit in creating a hostile work environment. It is a catastrophic failure of core values.
Option B suggests quietly pulling your peers aside later in private to tell them to knock it off.
This protects their egos. But it leaves the junior airmen who witnessed the event with the impression that intermediate leadership tolerates toxic behavior. You utterly fail to correct the organizational climate for the subordinates in the room.
Option C suggests filing a formal equal opportunity complaint immediately without addressing your peers face-to-face first.
This bypasses your inherent NCO authority and clogs the formal reporting system with an issue you are doctrinally required to correct at the lowest possible level.
So you have to do it right there, out in the open.
The highly effective answer, option E, dictates you intervene immediately. You professionally but firmly tell the TSGTs, Their conversation violates Air Force standards, deliberately correcting the environment in front of the airmen.
Even if it makes things tense.
In EO and sharp scenarios, the standard is immediate, highly visible intervention to restore psychological safety. You have to demonstrate moral courage, even if it makes the break room uncomfortable.
Our final clinical evaluation is Scenario 15, focusing on equal opportunity and cultural insensitivity. You are the NCOIC of a dining facility. A senior airman makes a joke relying on a harmful racial stereotype.
Another climate indicator.
The receiving airman laughs out loud and does not seem offended at all. Your subordinate staff sergeant hears the joke perfectly clearly, but walks away without saying a word. This is Kohlberg's post-conventional reasoning put to the test.
It absolutely is.
Option D dictates assuming that because the recipient laughed, no harm was done, and intervening would just create a massive EO issue where none existed. No offense, no foul, right?
Wrong. The clinical consequence of assuming no offense means no foul is the normalization of deviance that eventually metastasizes into severe toxic climate issues and potential moral injury.
The joke itself is the problem.
The joke inherently creates a discriminatory climate, regardless of the immediate recipient's reaction. It violates explicit Air Force policy.
Let's look at option A, which suggests delaying the staff sergeant's counseling until their next scheduled performance feedback session in a few months.
This separates the corrective action from the triggering event, thereby tacitly approving their silence in the moment.
Option B suggests immediately writing an Article 15 for the senior airman.
That is excessively heavy-handed and bypasses progressive discipline protocols entirely.
So we have to address both the airman and the NCO who ignored it.
The highly effective answer is option E. You must immediately correct the senior airman, explaining why the stereotype violates core values despite the lack of visible offense. Then, you must privately counsel the staff sergeant on their complete abdication of supervisory responsibility.
Public correction for the climate, private correction for the leader.
You must address the airman publicly to immediately rectify the climate, but you address the staff sergeant privately to maintain their supervisory credibility while ruthlessly correcting their failure to act.
We have completed the clinical dissection of the scenarios. We must now synthesize this massive amount of data into actionable intelligence for the listener.
This is where pattern recognition is key.
I want to distill this analytical breakdown into what I call the if you see this, think that pattern recognition matrix. Listen closely. When the scenario queue involves multiple NCOs involved doing tactical work, your competency target is delegation strategy.
The trap is solving the tactical problem yourself, the SSTD trap.
Exactly. When you see a civilian employee, your target is authority boundaries and labor rules.
The trap is treating them exactly like a military subordinate and violating their contract.
Right. When you encounter a safety concern combined with immense time pressure, your target is risk management authority.
The trap is escalating to the commander and inducing analysis paralysis or abandoning the safety rule entirely.
When dealing with peer NCO conflict, your target is lateral leadership.
The trap is yielding to aggressive peers or taking tribal sides to defend your own people.
And finally, when documentation is mentioned, your target is administrative precision.
The trap is taking punitive action without a structural paper trail or falsifying documents to protect someone.
To operationalize that matrix, candidates must internalize a 5-point TSG mindset self-assessment. Before finalizing any scenario analysis on the test, execute this clinical checklist in your mind.
Point 1, the subordinate check. Did I solve this problem for my staff sergeants, or did I guide them to solve it themselves?
Point 2, the escalation check. Is this a problem I have the positional authority to fix right now, or am I passing the buck to the flight chief out of fear?
Point 3, the civilian check. Am I rigorously respecting the legal and positional boundaries of the civilian workforce?
Point 4, the emotion check. Is my proposed response driven by affective conflict, my own anger or frustration, or by cognitive conflict, a desire to fix the underlying process using fact?
And point 5, the risk check. Am I unnecessarily halting the mission over a highly manageable risk, or am I intelligently accepting the necessary risk to achieve the objective through satisficing?
Executing this checklist requires massive cognitive bandwidth. The WPS SJT utilizes bounded rationality within the test architecture itself. You have a ticking clock.
You must satisfice the straightforward scenarios rapidly to preserve your cognitive stamina for parsing the complex ethical and resource dilemmas.
You simply cannot afford analysis paralysis during the examination. We have systematically exposed the psychological architecture, the psychometric traps, and the catastrophic clinical consequences of failing to adapt to the intermediate leadership tier.
It is a profound psychological
Further, I want to leave you with a final specific question to evaluate your own cognitive readiness. Consider the systemic nature of these frameworks. When an organization relies strictly on rote rule following and analytical intelligence, what happens when the operational environment inevitably plunges into ambiguity? If we don't train leaders to satisfice and navigate the gray zones, are our bureaucratic systems actually designing their own clinical failure?
That is a chilling thought.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Stay sharp.